can start with, obviously, the Tren de Aragua case. Judge Boasberg in the district court in D.C. tried to order planes to turn around, and planes carrying illegal aliens, members of a gang that President Trump had declared a foreign terrorist organization. These determinations that President Trump made aren't reviewable by the terms of the Alien Enemies Act and by his inherent Article 2 power. This is just not a place where judges get to play around. The movement of these individuals to El Salvador was part of the conduct of our foreign affairs. These are foreign nationals. And moreover, it's not really something that should have been subject to a federal injunction in the first place because, as the courts have said for a long time, deportation, removal, it's not irreparable harm. So it's not the kind of thing that should be subject to an early injunction, because the reason being that if you are wrongfully deported, that can be reversed and you can come back. It's not one of these unfixable harms. So the way in which that the judiciary has been weaponized against the president's policies, that's the first and most obvious one. And it's a particularly egregious because it goes to the president's core Article 2 authority, core foreign affairs authority. This is about the president's ability to deter an invasion or a predatory incursion. And none of this is reviewable. It's such a terrible ruling that we've been calling for the judge's impeachment.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on the State of Freedom.
The State of Freedom is a listener-supported podcast. We're committed to pursuing the truth about policymaking, decisions, and situations in Louisiana and at the national level that stand to impact our freedoms.
Please become a monthly supporter of the State of Freedom at freedomstate.us as we continue to expand the voice of liberty across Louisiana and beyond.
Good morning. Joining us today is Will Chamberlain. He's senior counsel at the Article 3 project, and we will be talking to him about the levers that exist or could be created to rein in rogue judges. We'll also discuss how the Trump administration is navigating the insane rulings that are obstructing his agenda. Before we do that, let me read the scripture of the day. It's Psalms 58, and it's the whole thing. And I think everyone will really appreciate this one. Will, probably you most of all. It says, God's justice, you high and mighty politicians know nothing about it. Which one of you has walked in justice towards others? Which one of you has treated everyone right and fair? Not one. You only give justice in exchange for a bribe. For the right price, you let others get away with murder. Wicked wanderers, even from the womb, that's who you are. Lying with your words, your teaching is poison. Like cobras closing their ears to the most expert of charmers, you strike out against all who are near. God, break their fangs, shatter the teeth of these ravenous lions. Let them disappear like water falling on thirsty ground. Let all their weapons be useless. Let them be like snails dissolving into slime. Let them be cut off, never seeing the light of day. God will sweep them away so fast that they'll never know what hit them. The godly will celebrate in the triumph of good over evil, and the lovers of God will trample the wickedness of the wicked under their feet. Then everyone will say, there is a God who judges the judges, and there is great reward in loving God. So let me encourage all of us to be reading and decreeing Psalm 58 over our nation so that the corruption of the judges would be judged and moved out of the way, and the work of honest men and women of integrity can move forward in service to the people of this country.
And that's exactly, Danielle, what the Article 3 project is doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely, with a lot of courage and just relentless effort. And we're just so thankful to have Article 3 and so thankful to have Will Chamberlain here on the State of Freedom for the second time, senior counsel for the Article 3 project. Will, thank you for joining us today for a little while, sir.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I want to start off here, Will. I was doing a little reading about this lawlessness that's occurring in the federal judiciary right now. And I found something that Thomas Jefferson said that seemed to be warning against exactly what is going on right now in the federal judiciary. He said the Constitution is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. And it looks like this lawless judiciary that we're seeing now, their effort to contort the plain words of the Constitution to advance a particular agenda is occurring right now. And it's like it's absolutely insane what we're seeing. What are a couple of examples that you're seeing that are most troubling to you about the conduct of federal judges right now in connection with Trump's efforts to engage in what really is constitutionally legitimate executive authority?
Yeah, I mean, we can start with obviously the Tren de Aragua case. Judge Boasberg in the district court in D.C. tried to order planes to turn around, and planes carrying illegal aliens, criminal illegal aliens, members of a gang that President Trump had declared a foreign terrorist organization. These determinations that President Trump made aren't reviewable by the terms of the Alien Enemies Act and by his inherent Article 2 power. This is just not a place where judges get to play around. The movement of these individuals to El Salvador was part of the conduct of our foreign affairs. These are foreign nationals. And moreover, it's not really something that should have been subject to a federal injunction in the first place, because as the courts have said for a long time, deportation, removal, it's not irreparable harm. So it's not the kind of thing that should be subject to an early injunction, because the reason being that if you are wrongfully deported, that can be reversed and you can come back. It's not one of these unfixable harms. So the way in which that the judiciary has been weaponized against the president's policies, that's the first and most obvious one. And it's a particularly egregious because it goes to the president's core Article 2 authority, core foreign affairs authority. This is about the president's ability to deter an invasion or predatory incursion. And none of this is reviewable. It's such a terrible ruling that we've been calling for the judge's impeachment. We think that most, they're wrong rulings that it can get appealed every day. And we wouldn't say that every incorrect ruling from a judge deserves impeachment. But this is so wrong and such a dramatic encroachment on core Article 2 authority of the president, such a violation of the separation of powers that we don't see any other remedy. We think certainly he should face an impeachment trial. That's one. There are a couple of others. We have a different judge in D.C. striking down the new order that transgender people not be allowed into the military. This is kind of obviously something that's within the discretion of the military. There are obviously military readiness concerns. Up until very recently, this was considered a mental disorder, a significant one. And just to kind of clarify this, I've been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. This have many people in this country, for whatever reason, struggle to keep things organized. That is sufficient to get you barred from the military, right? As a disorder, one that many, many people have, a mild one that can be dealt with medication. How is a disorder that requires you to go undertake serious hormone therapy and in some cases surgery to remove perfectly good body parts not a sufficient mental disorder to justify keeping you out of the military? And yet apparently this judge, in her wisdom, quoting the historically totally relevant play Hamilton, created like 5 years ago, decided that this was just unconstitutional. It's laughably silly. Her ruling was laughably silly, and somehow this is an injunction that she feels comfortable putting in. Now, to her credit, her mild credit, she did stay her ruling, allowing the appeals courts to rule on it before she put it into effect. But I think that's an example of just how out of pocket the courts have gotten. And I think the big meta point that I would make to Chief Justice Roberts and make to your audience as well. Chief Justice Roberts has always been about judicial restraint, the idea that judges should kind of confine themselves to their role. And he seems to have that restraint attitude here. The problem is that when your lower court judges are wildly unrestrained, for the Supreme Court to be restrained is to enable insanity, to enable anarchy. It is on the job of the Chief Justice to rein in the lower court judges under his supervision.
Yeah, yet his position, which was just so feeble and so weak, what he said in response to this is that disagreement over a judicial decision is not legitimate grounds for impeachment. And I'm like, Justice Roberts, this is not just a disagreement over a judicial decision. This is an abuse of power. This is a clear invasion of executive authority in the Constitution. This is not, quote, good behavior as the Constitution requires federal judges to engage in. And I was like, that just seemed so weak and so unresponsive to the gravity of the concerns that are going on here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I thought it was a bizarre statement for him to make. It's a statement he hasn't made in the past in the context of any other impeachment, say the impeachment of President Trump, or the calls for impeachment of the justices who were in the majority on Dobbs, which included him. Or actually, no, he wasn't in the majority. He was just in concurrence. But there were 5 justices in the majority on Dobbs. Ocasio-Cortez, a number of people, filed articles of impeachment against Alito and Thomas in the aftermath of that. Didn't say a word. And moreover, I think it actually was appropriate for him not to say anything because impeachment he has no role to play in the question of impeachment. The impeachment is something that's the role of the House of Representatives, and conviction is up to the Senate. The president doesn't have any role, and the Supreme Court doesn't have any role in impeachment. Other than if there's an impeachment of a president, he gets to sit as the neutral arbiter.
Yeah,
but that's,
I was about to say, yeah, but that's it.
So he doesn't, it's not his business. Why is he going out there and issuing personal press releases rather than, what is he doing? He's stepping into the political arena. And he's been doing all sorts of things that are bizarre. In this USAID case, for example, where, Judge Ali in DC ordered $2 billion dispersed, which has all sorts of independent jurisdictional problems as highlighted in the dissent. Justice Roberts stayed that injunction, and then he was part of the 5 justice majority that lifted the stay. And he said in that opinion, we think that the judge should account for the logistical difficulties of paying these funds out when he's shaping his next move and specify who is going to get these payments. Well, okay, but then you're actually forcing the judge to modify his order, which means you're vacating the original order in the first place. You should have said that. You should have said what we are doing is vacating the underlying order because it's not a lawful order. It's too vague. It orders the government to do things that are wrong. But instead, he allowed that order to go forward, but just gave some advice about how to fix it. Well, that's too cute. You are being too cute by half. And I think that fundamentally captures what Roberts and Barrett are doing. They are being too cute by half. They know that what the lower judge courts are doing is lawless, but they aren't willing to come out and say it. They're for whatever reason. And that's not acceptable. And when the 4 other conservative justices are like, what are you doing? Clearly lawless. You even effectively admit it. By attempting to be restrained, you are undermining the legitimacy of the court. You are clearly engaging as political actors, trying to give advice rather than rule on the cases and controversies in front of you.
The secret to losing weight 2 times faster has gone viral. See the transformations hundreds of thousands of people are experiencing around the world with the Slenderized drops. These homeopathic drops are proven to control appetite, support thyroid function, help balance the body's pH, improve energy, boost mood, and increase metabolic rate. I've heard firsthand testimonials from droppers in their 20s to droppers in their 80s who say that the Slenderized drops have completely revolutionized their lives. Try the drops today to see the results for yourself. To learn more about the Slenderized drops or other incredible natural wellness and lifestyle products, email me at info@freedomstate.us and put drops in the subject line or visit the Shop Our Partners page at freedomstate.us. We also have links to those in the show notes. Thank you for supporting the state of freedom. Yeah, I'm starting to wonder if there's a new class in law school with coloring books, with some of the way that the judges are putting down these rulings. It seems so insane. And I agree with you, Will, that if everybody was stayed in their lane according to the constitutionally outlined separation of powers doctrine, we wouldn't be experiencing any of this. Is there a place for legislation that would rein in rogue judges? I saw on X
Yes.
where Mike Davis mentioned the need for this specifically.
Yeah, people need to familiarize themselves with the notion of jurisdiction stripping. So I think a lot of people are focused on impeachment, and we are going to go forward. Don't get me wrong. We still think Boasberg should be impeached. We're also realistic. We don't have 67 votes for that. But in our view, the process is the punishment, and we need to deter this behavior from other judges. So go forward with that. But in terms of actually getting something passed, something to change in law how this works, jurisdiction stripping. Congress, in their wisdom, can regulate the conduct of the lower courts, can take powers away, can say that federal district courts are not allowed to hear certain cases. They can create new courts to hear cases that they think that those courts should hear, or they can completely bar courts from taking certain types of cases. They've done so in the habeas context. There's been a whole, we don't remember this, but a lot of liberal jurists, especially in the 90s, were really exploiting habeas corpus and doing all sorts of things to meddle with criminal justice. And then Congress passed something called the AEDPA, which was legislation that dramatically constrained the role of the judiciary in evaluating habeas petitions, basically saying you can only grant a habeas petition under extraordinary circumstances. So we could do something like that here. I've thought about, you could entirely strip from federal district courts the right to have any role over the removal of illegal aliens. You could create a new court, stack it with new Republican appointees, and call it the border circuit or something, and at the border district court, and say that this is where all these were everywhere in the country. If you were having a habeas removal case, it goes here. It gets steered to this particular court. And then we can get proper rulings rather than allowing it to be all over the country and all these and eliminate the judge shopping that goes on in order to thwart a federal border policy. So there's a lot of things Congress can do. I mean, obviously you need to get past a filibuster, but attach it to a must-pass bill. I mean, we've already seen that Congress is terrified, and particularly the Democrats are terrified of a shutdown. Schumer just agreed to a CR that he hated because they're terrified of what we will do with the shutdown. Great. We're going to take advantage of that. Next time a CR comes up and there's a shutdown threatened, the CR includes jurisdiction stripping of particular issues away from federal district courts, because we aren't scared of a shutdown. We're the ones who would be okay with it, and our caucus is united.
I love this idea of jurisdiction stripping, because as I was thinking this through, what Mike said on Twitter, I was like, if they're not respecting the Constitution, what reason do we have to believe that they will respect any other law that's new on the books? But if it just literally takes the toys out of their playroom, then they're not going to be able to do anything.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that if you actually jurisdiction strip, you make it very easy to appeal. Any district court judge can almost be ignored. You can just get an immediate stay from the appellate court or the Supreme Court. Yeah. If they like to play games, but even one rogue district judge, they try and play a game here. The appellate court and the Supreme Court is going to look at a new jurisdiction stripping statute that is directly on point and say no. Yeah. And if they don't, they've completely obliterated their legitimacy, because they've decided to ignore a law passed by Congress directly on point.
Yeah.
So.
And Will, of course, none of what we're talking about now would really be necessary if the U.S. Supreme Court did its job, was doing its job right now.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, I know you can't get inside anybody's head, but what do you think accounts for this glaring discrepancy between the way Justice Roberts treated the Trump impeachment proceedings and people close to Trump, the way he treated it in those situations, and his response now? Because you're right, there seems to be just gross intellectual inconsistency in his position on this. What do you think accounts for that?
I think what accounts for it is that he was appointed by a Republican president, but that president was George Bush. That's the dead and gone Republican Party. So he's sort of a member or a partisan of a party that doesn't exist, and that is particularly angry about how the Republican Party has dramatically changed to now be a populist nationalist party. So I think that he doesn't like President Trump, and it's as simple as that. He has a personal dislike for him. It afflicted a lot of his rulings in the first administration, where he found all sorts of exceptions to normal rules and started interrogating the motivations of the president in circumstances where that was totally inappropriate. He created new tests. His jurisprudence was a mess. And it was a mess because he just really personally didn't like the president. Not a good enough excuse in my view at all. And I think, it is hard to get in his head, but it definitely seems like one of those cases where the guy's just, he's angry and he's resentful of President Trump. He really doesn't like him. I'm sure he really didn't like January 6th. I'm sure he's not happy with the fact that he's the president again and would prefer Kamala. But, them's the breaks. Like, he's still got to do his job. And the thing that the judiciary really has to worry about, it's not just this jurisdiction stripping legislation. It's being ignored. There's a great thread by Margot Cleveland, who writes for the Federalist, and she was a former clerk on the Seventh Circuit, I believe. And she wrote a thread and she talked about how people are saying, "Oh, the administration's causing a constitutional crisis," and she's like, "No, they're bending over backwards to find ways to comply with the letter of the rulings, even if they're not doing so with the spirit, even though these rulings are lawless and are impinging on the authority of the executive branch. They're trying to give the judiciary a chance to retreat from the ledge aggressively." And these district court judges are like getting more and more aggressive in response to that, asserting broad power to do whatever they want and demanding immediate, compliance with not merely their written orders, but their oral statements in court.
Yeah. Will, there was a former president, it might have been Andrew Jackson, and I can't remember exactly what situation he was dealing with, but the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision that was clearly unconstitutional, clearly violated on executive power. And Jackson said, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, now let them enforce it. So the reason I'm asking it is this: what would happen if the Trump administration began to ignore these rulings? Chief Justice Marshall said that any law that facially violates the Constitution is null and void on its face. So if these rulings are null and void, is there an argument to be made that the president should just ignore some of this?
It's hard to say. I mean, at a certain point, you have to, because if they're interfering with core Article 2 prerogatives, then it's just, these are co-equal branches, right? We don't live in a juristocracy. We don't want to live in a juristocracy where the courts are supreme to everyone. And so I think there was a part of the brief, one of the briefs they've been filing in the Tren de Aragua cases. I mean, you see these briefs, they're like, we are trying to comply with your orders, but they are interfering with core Article 2 prerogatives, and you should withdraw. You should come back from the brink. And it's something lawyers notice, when that brief in that district court case was signed by Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, Emil Bove, and a slew of other top Justice Department lawyers. That's the Justice Department's way of saying, like, you need to change course. When the entire top echelon of the Justice Department signs a random brief, that's like, they care. They're not, this is the administration screaming at the judge to get his act together.
Right.
And it's
precisely because we don't want to be in a position where we have to ignore a ruling, where we have to ignore an order. We want a constitutionally harmonious system and process. But essentially, if you kind of read beneath the lines there, Will, they are saying either you're going to pull back from the ledge, you're going to begin to honor the Constitution and stay in your lane, or we're going to have no choice but to begin ignoring these rulings for the good of the country. That seems to be the message.
That is. And I hope the courts pull back from the brink here, because they're so out of pocket on this. I mean, this isn't Dobbs, right? Like, Dobbs is so different. Like, even if you kind of have a democratic mindset where you think Dobbs was this unjust ruling that violated precedent, et cetera. Well, that's something that was clearly within the Supreme Court's jurisdiction to determine, right? You may think they got it wrong, but the question of whether or not the right to privacy in the Constitution encompasses abortion policy is an obviously legal question that is not an Article 2 authority. It's not a congressional authority. It's literally just the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution and what rights exist. So you think they got it wrong. Okay, well, they got it wrong, but they got it wrong within the judicial lane. What they're doing by trying to, like, direct the flight of planes and mess with foreign affairs, they're just so clearly impinging on the other branches. They're not respecting the executive as a co-equal branch. So that's the real constitutional crisis here. The constitutional crisis is not how the president is acting. The constitutional crisis is how the judiciary is acting and what they're doing to kind of create this problem.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that Tren de Aragua deportation situation. I saw where Mike Davis this morning had posted a clip of an article that he did or an interview rather, he did with Heartland News, where he said an activist judge ordering planes to turn around during a national security operation is not a quote unquote judicial decision. That is highly illegal and extremely dangerous sabotage of the presidency, which is an impeachable offense. But you mentioned that we don't have a 2/3 majority in the Senate to impeach these judges. So at what point, Will, do you think we start calling it what it is, which in my view is just treason?
I don't think, I mean, I wouldn't say it's treason, but then I don't think much of anything is treason, right? So, but I would just say it's impeachable conduct. It's high crimes and misdemeanors, right? It's deserving of impeachment. And if we're not going to be able to impeach, then I think the answer is then we're just going to strip you of your authority. Then we're going to create new courts and replace, we abolished the court in the first instance. We're not going to impeach you saying that you necessarily committed a crime. We're just going to say that your court doesn't exist anymore. Because if you're a lower court, remember, only the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution. All the inferior courts are established by Congress. That's actually what's written in the Constitution. So Congress in its wisdom can abolish them, can join them together, strip their jurisdiction, any number of things. And
Well,
if
what
this is
if
the
you
way they're
do
going to
that?
conduct themselves.
What if you do that, Will, but you've still got a United States Supreme Court that is sympathetic to these radical judges, and you could end up having a major confrontation between the Congress and the United States Supreme Court. And in that situation, what if the U.S. Supreme Court says, but Congress?
Yeah, well, the funny thing is then they would be reversing precedent on an issue where they're directly conflicted, right? Precedent on this, they've admitted in previous Supreme Court cases that Congress can jurisdiction strip, and they have, the courts don't get to say anything about it. Outside of, they don't get to jurisdiction strip the Supreme Court, but they can jurisdiction strip lower courts, right? And that I think if you tried to say to the Supreme Court, like, you don't get to hear certain, you can say some cases aren't subject to judicial review then I think you have to be within core Article 2 authority to make that argument. It's like they got away with it with habeas, I think, as we discussed. It's actually an interesting area of constitutional law now that I think about it. But the broader point is, if the Supreme Court tried to say you are not allowed to jurisdiction strip these lower courts, well, then they'd just be ignored because they're reversing precedent. They'd be wrong. There's no constitutional basis for what they would be saying. Like, they're just essentially forcing, it's like, okay, now we're ignoring you. Like, you are incorrect. We are ignoring. This is wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you rely, and moreover, like, you rely on us to give you money. Like, you don't have a treasury. You don't have tax dollars. Like, the money stops. These courts don't exist. Where the executive branch is going to send in, remove everybody from their offices. There's not going to be any trials in those courthouses. The courts don't have the ability because they don't have they don't have an army. They don't have police other than a few like random magistrates. They don't have anybody. They don't have anybody to enforce their rulings except legitimacy, which is again why they're so mistaken in what they're doing. Like they're damaging the legitimacy of the court. So
That's such a great point, but because they don't have armies to send. First of all, it's not their role to enforce the law. So all they really have is their inherent legitimacy, which they are busy eroding right now. They're creating such doubt among the American people about whether or not these things that they're doing and saying are legitimate. But I want to go back, Will, to a point you made a little while ago about impeachment, when you said that the punishment is the process, or the process is the punishment. We know there's no way that we could successfully, convict in the Senate, a federal judge. But Danielle and I were talking pre-show. When you say the punishment is in the process, these federal judges particularly are absolutely not used to being scrutinized. They're not used to having the rocks in their own lives overturned and viewed. And so I really believe that you're right. That could have a powerful deterrent effect, simply having to go through that process. So it's the Article 3's position that this is a very, very important prong in the attack, even though there's very little likelihood that they could actually be removed from office.
Yeah, judges are also, they're so used to being powerful, I guess, and really powerful. Speaking as a lawyer, whenever I've argued in federal court, and I don't think, if you haven't had this experience, you will never feel concentrated sovereignty that powerfully. Like, the judge asks you questions. When they start talking, you must stop. If you don't do what the judge wants, the judge at any moment can say, you contempt, and you get to hang out in the jail in the court. They can't do that forever, but they just have the immediate power because they want to yoink you and put you into contempt. And because of that, there's an imperiousness to the behavior of these federal judges. Some of them are still, very good and conscientious people, but some of them let the power get to their heads. How could they not? There was always power affects people different. And so, even extracting a formal apology from a judge is a huge victory there because it's so humbling for them. So the idea of going through an impeachment and having to hire lawyers and defend yourself and potentially lose the position that you had life tenure for, that you thought you're going to do for the remainder of your life as long as you want to. I mean, that's a big thing to do to somebody. And so, this guy Boasberg, I think, he's under the impression that, I have my job for life. He's just used to being a powerful person that everyone has to respect and honor the wishes of. And what happens if that's not the case? And I think that in a lot of ways, what's happened in DC is that, the power has gotten to a lot of these judges' heads, and they aren't as busy as the judges in other circuits. I can tell you that. Like, I actually interned in that court, worked for one of the federal judges, Rudolph Contreras. Good guy. I'm not going to say he's a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's a good boss. But the docket wasn't that busy. People worked a 9 to 5 in that court. Because DC, if you think about it, a federal court in DC is pretty small. It's only covering the District of Columbia. The Fourth Circuit covers both Maryland and Virginia surrounding. So there's not that many cases. And it's not that many federal cases. So people are leisurely getting to enjoy the perks of their power there.
Yeah. Well, your point, the reason why the founding fathers, in their wisdom, gave federal judges lifetime appointments and made them non-electable is so that they would not be vulnerable or subject to political influence, so that they could make decisions based upon the facts and on the law, not based on politics or who's donating to their campaigns or who they need to pay back. But the negative side of that is precisely that type of unilateral power and authority and permanency breeds arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about that. The founding fathers were wise in establishing that. But on the other hand, unless you are connected to a greater power, it seems like inevitably it would lead to the kind of arrogance that you're talking about, and the kind of arrogance that has led to some of this lunacy that we're seeing in these decisions.
True, and there's also a bit of amateur hour. I mean, I look at this guy, Judge Ali, who's on the district court, who's been messing around. I mean, he's been a judge for what, a couple months? I mean, he was appointed in the lame duck.
Wow.
And you look at this guy, I mean, he's a Canadian citizen. He's been an American citizen for about 5 years, practiced American law for about 5 years, maybe a little less. Well, what's he doing on the bench? Sorry,
Yeah.
he might be smart, and I'm sure he's, a capable writer and all that stuff. Like, you can't go through law school and reach these heights without being a competent, a smart guy and a competent writer. But how grounded is he in American law? How grounded is he in what he needs to do this job? And why did the Democrats think like, oh yeah, we should get this Canadian guy to be a judge in an American court? He's only been here 5 years. What are they doing? It's just, yeah. So you've got a combination of the arrogance on the one hand of these long-term judges, but you've also got just sort of a lack of wisdom and knowledge coming from some of these guys.
And Will, maybe just to zoom out for a minute to the big picture. So you have worked in politics, you've worked on campaigns, you've worked as an attorney. If you were to guess, what does your gut tell you about how long this kind of like ground warfare against the Trump agenda is going to take place? Do you have any sense about at which point we may just click over and things will be able to operate in a some kind of meaningful, regular way, for lack of a better way of saying it?
I mean, it depends on when the Supreme Court gets its act together. I could see them getting their act together within the month, right? They get an appeal that comes to them and they finally issue an opinion that's like and I wouldn't be surprised. They've said it before. You shouldn't be injunctions beyond the parties in the courtroom, right? And some like serious slapdowns from them. That could happen in a month. That could happen in a couple of months. That would get things back to normal. But if they don't, then the end result becomes this disregard that we're talking about.
We've all had instances crop up where we could use the advice or skills of a trusted attorney. Whether you're looking at the implications of new laws for your business, signing a contract or a lease, looking to write a will or establish a trust, or even resolve a dispute with your credit card company, LegalShield has got you covered. For over 50 years, LegalShield has made it affordable and easy to access a dedicated lawyer. With the app, LegalShield is like having a lawyer in your back pocket. For covered emergencies, LegalShield is here for you 24/7, plans to fit any stage of life. The State of Freedom is proud to be teamed up with LegalShield as clients and affiliates. To learn more or to sign up, visit the Shop Our Partners page on freedomstate.us or check out the link in the show notes. Thank you for supporting the State of Freedom.
Are we looking, Will, at some point at a major confrontation between the executive and the judicial branches of government. Hopefully we avoid that. Hopefully we come to a point where the American people are not watching the executive branch of government completely divorce itself from the judiciary, because that is a real constitutional crisis. What is the likelihood that we end up in a major constitutional crisis in this country where the executive branch is acting in defiance of of the judiciary, of judicial rulings? Obviously, we hope that that can be avoided, because we don't want a situation where the American people are looking at a divided government that way. It's a sad spectacle to have to see. So what is the likelihood that we're going to be able to avoid it?
I mean, I think we'll be able to avoid it because I think the Supreme Court will ultimately do the right thing. And I think much of the problem here is rooted in the fact that all this stuff is coming up on these temporary restraining order grounds, which is just a weird procedural posture for these things to be coming to the court. Normally, temporary restraining orders are unappealable. So I think that when these things kind of go through regular order, when preliminary injunctions get issued, things will get fixed. So, I mean, a good example of that is there was the Office of Special Counsel case where this guy, Hampton Dellinger, was appointed by the Biden administration, was sitting as the head of this Office of Special Counsel, which is this sort of ombudsman role for federal employees and trying to protect them. Trump fired him. He had the right to fire him under existing law. That guy tried to fight to keep his job. The district court imposed an injunction, and the district court finally imposed their preliminary injunction. That went right up to the DC Circuit Court, who immediately stated, a few days later, issued an opinion that was correct on the merits. That was just right. No, given current law, obviously Trump can fire this guy, period. So I have confidence that these things will get fixed once they come up on regular order, once the preliminary injunctions are issued and then heard by the appeals courts. So that's why I'm confident we'll ultimately avoid this problem, but it doesn't address the fact that there's still been a lot of harm done to the administration by the lawless temporary restraining orders imposed by these judges.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, and I would also say they're tying up a lot of resources of the DOJ. I mean, for the administration or the White House to have to come and argue every single case, argue for every single action that the Trump administration takes, seems to be wasting a lot of gas.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so.
Mike Davis said at one point, Will, that the ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court that some of these rulings are encouraging and empowering other radical federal judges who may be inclined to act this way to do so. So it's not just these cases that are being affected, but it is setting a precedent whereby other radical judges look at this and feel like they have the authority or the cover to do the same thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's right. I think it's like, essentially, I think this is the big mistake Roberts is making. He's thinking that, I can, issue these subtle warnings and that'll stop people. It's like, no, I mean, this is true in every field of human endeavor. If you're weak, you embolden your adversaries. If you're weak, you embolden bad behavior. So I think it's, again, the failure, this continued focus on restraint by the higher courts is allowing anarchy to reign at the lower.
Well, before we let you go, I believe you're familiar with the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. It's been getting a lot of attention in the news. Would you mind just telling us why this race is so critical and maybe a message to any listeners in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, this case is critical because Wisconsin, like North Carolina, has this Supreme Court that seems to flip back and forth. And, interestingly, given how these courts are always supposed to be so focused on law, the flipping of a court from 4 to 3 immediately means a radical change in the districting maps, some magically in the state every single time. So this Wisconsin Supreme Court election might seem minor, but it's very, very important. It'll control how many Republican representatives come out of Wisconsin in the future, how much of a voice you as a Republican voter will have there. Early voting is open. Go vote. Like, I know people always talk about making a plan to vote. I'm not a believer in that. I'm a believer in, like, next time you see a polling station, just go show up and wait in line. Just do it. Assuming you're off work. Like, if you're off work, go to get it done. So go early vote, get your vote in. You don't have to think about it anymore, and you're doing your part to ensure that, your voice will be heard and there will be more Republican representatives in your state in the future.
And Will, because what you're saying is that this election, this Supreme Court justice election in Wisconsin, could have direct bearing on the balance of power in the U.S. Congress.
Correct. It's very close. We need to win these and stop. Like, we have a bigger majority. Given the fact that we won the popular vote, we should have had a much stronger congressional majority, and we don't. We're obviously within 2 or 3 seats in a 435 person House.
It is absolutely precarious. You're exactly right. And we complain a lot about the Republicans, and there's a lot to complain about, believe me, but there's no comparison to this and what would be occurring if the Democrats were in control in the U.S. Congress.
Oh, yeah. And honestly, this is something, we haven't talked a lot about this. I don't see people giving a lot of props to Mike Johnson and to the House Freedom Caucus.
Yeah.
For the entire Republican caucus, save for Thomas Massey, who's doing his own thing, and it's bizarre. Everybody else is on the same page. They unified and they passed a continuing resolution with no Democratic votes. And they couldn't lose anybody but Thomas Massey. That's wild, and it's great. And if you saw what happened, it was Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries were going to war because they didn't know what to do. They had this big fight about, do we pass this continuing resolution that includes a bunch of stuff we hate, or do we let a shutdown go forward and let Elon and Trump do whatever they want with the government? And they couldn't agree on the right strategy, and they were fighting like crazy over it. And because the Republicans are united, the Democrats are broken. Yeah. So I just hope that continues. And I think, I kind of preach this message. It's really important for everybody. The Freedom Caucus did really good by putting, I saw Andy Biggs put out a video where he said, I've never voted for a continuing resolution before because I want to balance the budget. I'm voting for this one because President Trump has asked for it. Good. Like, first things first, because I think people don't understand if we don't get a continuing resolution with just Republican votes, the Democrats will demand very, very damaging concessions in terms of restricting the authority of DOJ and restricting the authority of the White House.
Yeah.
So
what was the breakdown on that vote, Will, that continuing resolution vote? Was it one? We passed it by one vote?
I had 1 or 2
votes.
I don't think we could have lost any more than Massey. I think they had to be completely united.
It was extremely close. Yeah, that's what I thought. Will Chamberlain, Senior Counsel for the Article 3 Project, thank you so much for your insights today, man. We enjoyed having you, and
absolutely,
we look forward to having you back soon.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.